Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Project Cybersyn and the world that tried to build it. Here's the bold idea. In the early 1970s, one nation attempted to run its economy with the precision of a living organism, guided not by markets alone or by a single central command, but by information. To understand why anyone would try that, we have to stand at Chile's crossroads. Picture Chile in 1970 to 1973, a narrow country stretching thousands of miles, but politically right at the center of the Cold War map. Salvador Allende has just won a democratic election on a promise that sounded paradoxical to both superpowers, a socialist transformation achieved through constitutional, electoral means. Not a coup, not a one-party revolution. The Chilean road to socialism. That phrase mattered. It signaled that the ballot box, not the bayonet, would do the heavy lifting. But it also raised a question that will echo through our entire story. Can you rewire an economy while keeping democratic circuits intact? Now, the economy. Imagine walking into a factory where the tools are aging, the spare parts are scarce, and the price of everything seems to drift upward faster than paychecks. That was Chile's day-to-day reality. The government moved to nationalize key industries, think copper, banking, and large-scale manufacturing, on the theory that strategic sectors should serve public goals. In the short term, that shift meant massive coordination problems. Who orders inputs? Who sets production schedules? Who allocates fuel when trucks are stuck on mountain roads? Meanwhile, inflation pressures began to mount. Wages rose, prices chased, and expectations outran supply. Add persistent labor unrest, and you have a feedback loop that could either stabilize through smart coordination or spiral. Which way would it go? At the same time, Chile sought a distinct path, neither Moscow's rigid centralism nor Havana's exportable revolution. The aim was a uniquely Chilean model that combined electoral legitimacy with sweeping economic change. That is a tough needle to thread. On one hand, you want rapid transformation, on the other, you must keep pluralistic institutions humming and citizens willing to cooperate. How do you move fast without breaking the very mechanisms that confer legitimacy? How do you keep local knowledge, what workers and managers actually know, visible to policymakers who are far away? And remember the Cold War context pressing on the margins of every decision. External actors watched closely. Allies asked for proof that the experiment could deliver bread on the table, not just slogans in the plaza. Critics pointed to rising prices and shortages as evidence of systemic flaws. Inside the country, unions, business owners, and political parties competed to shape the direction of change. The result was a society that was energized, polarized, and improvising in real time. That's fertile ground for innovation and for missteps. So, why does all this matter for our topic? Because these pressures create the precise challenge that would inspire a technological solution. If you are trying to balance democratic legitimacy with sweeping economic coordination, you need fast, trustworthy information. You need a way to see the whole without smothering the parts. Imagine an orchestra whose musicians are scattered across hundreds of towns, each playing a different rhythm, and the conductor trying to keep the melody from dissolving into noise. Could better communication and smarter feedback turn that noise into music? Hold that thought. In this crucible, democratic socialism under the glare of the Cold War, nationalizations colliding with inflation and labor unrest, and a determination to pursue a uniquely Chilean path, an audacious idea took shape. If an economy behaves like a living system, perhaps it can be monitored and guided like one. The next slide introduces the thinker who believed exactly that, and set the stage for a project unlike anything the world had seen. If Project Cybersyn was a bold leap into the unknown, then Stafford Beer was the man who built the bridge midair. Now, Beer wasn't an economist in the conventional sense, and he certainly wasn't a Chilean politician. He was a British management theorist who believed that running an economy was, at its core, about understanding systems. Not just any systems, complex, living systems. Beer was a pioneer in what's called management cybernetics. Cybernetics, at its heart, is the study of how systems control themselves through feedback loops. Think about how your body regulates temperature. You get too hot, you sweat, you get too cold, you shiver. It's not random, it's a built-in system constantly adjusting to keep you alive. Beer took that principle and applied it to organizations. He argued that a factory, a corporation, even an entire economy could be thought of as a living organism, one that could sense changes in its environment and adjust in real time. If, and this is a big if, you gave it the right information fast enough. This was radical thinking for the early 1970s. While most economic planning was either rigidly top-down or chaotic and fragmented, Beer imagined something more dynamic. In his view, an economy could be like a brain, processing incoming data from every nerve ending, comparing it to past experience, predicting what might happen next, and sending out corrective signals almost instantly. The key? Feedback loops and adaptive control. If a factory was producing too slowly, the system would detect it. If transportation delays threatened to disrupt supply, the system could reroute resources before the damage spread. But Beer didn't stop at metaphors. He had a technological vision, way ahead of its time, that involved integrating data networks directly into industrial planning. Remember, this was an era when computers were room-sized machines and long-distance communication meant telex lines and paper printouts. Yet Beer imagined a national nervous system for the economy, a network linking factories, transport hubs, and government offices, all feeding data into a central decision-making hub. The idea wasn't to replace human judgment, but to make sure those decisions were grounded in accurate, up-to-the-minute information. His approach treated the economy not as a static blueprint to be followed, but as a living, breathing entity in constant conversation with itself. That meant the design had to allow for flexibility, local problem-solving, and quick corrections when reality didn't match the plan. So, in the early 70s, when Chile came looking for a way to coordinate its rapidly changing economy without falling into paralysis, Stafford Beer's ideas weren't just interesting, they were exactly what the situation demanded. He believed that, just as a healthy body responds to a sudden fever without waiting for a central committee to convene, a healthy economy could respond to shocks and challenges without grinding to a halt. In the next part, we'll see how Beer's theories leapt from paper into reality, how the Chilean government began wiring its economy together in one of the most ambitious experiments in economic management the world had ever seen. And it all started with a system called Cybersyn. Now we get to the heart of the experiment, Project Cybersyn itself. Imagine taking a country's entire industrial sector and trying to connect it like the neurons in a brain. That was the vision. And the first step in making it real was to build a communication backbone that could carry information quickly, reliably, and in a way that people could actually act on. The foundation was a nationwide telex network. At the time, telex machines were the workhorses of long-distance communication. Think of them as typewriters that could send messages instantly over a phone line. Cybersyn linked state-run factories to a central operations room in Santiago. This meant that production updates, supply shortages, or transportation issues could be reported in near real time, rather than waiting days or weeks for bureaucratic reports to trickle in. For a country as geographically stretched as Chile, over 2,000 miles long, this was transformative. Suddenly, the government had a direct line to the pulse of its economy. But raw data is just noise unless you can interpret it. That's where custom software for economic oversight came in. These programs weren't flashy by today's standards, but they were cutting edge for the early 70s. They could run economic models to test what-if scenarios, detect anomalies that might signal trouble in a factory or supply chain, and even predict potential bottlenecks before they became crises. In theory, this meant decision-makers could be proactive rather than reactive, heading off shortages or production slowdowns before they hurt the economy. And then there was the part of Cybersyn that still captures the imagination today, the futuristic operations room. Picture a space-age control center, ergonomic chairs, large-screen displays, centralized dashboards with blinking indicators, all arranged so teams could respond rapidly to incoming data. It wasn't just about looking modern. The design was deliberate. The screens and controls were laid out so decision-makers could see the big picture at a glance, spot emerging issues instantly, and coordinate a response without being buried in paperwork. In a sense, it was the physical brain of the system, processing sensory input from all over the country and sending back commands to keep things running smoothly. What's important here is that Cybersyn wasn't meant to micromanage every detail. Stafford Beer's philosophy emphasized adaptive control, setting broad goals and allowing local managers to solve problems within those parameters. The system would flag issues and provide the information needed to solve them, but it wouldn't dictate every move from the center. At least, that was the plan. In its most ambitious form, Cybersyn promised something unprecedented, a living, data-driven map of an entire national economy, visible and adjustable in real time. In a world where even large corporations struggle to coordinate across departments, Chile was attempting this for an entire country. And it wasn't just about technology, it was tied to a political vision, which is where we're headed next. The ideological ambitions behind this experiment, and how Cybersyn fit into a broader vision for a new kind of socialism. To really understand Cybersyn, you have to see it not just as wires and screens, but as a political statement, a vision of how technology could reshape society itself. This wasn't a neutral tool. It was designed with a very specific philosophy in mind, and that philosophy was deeply tied to Chile's experiment in democratic socialism. First, there was worker empowerment. In most economic systems, whether capitalist or centrally planned, the people on the shop floor, the workers actually running the machines, rarely have direct access to the kind of data that drives big decisions. Cybersyn aimed to change that. The idea was that workers and local managers could see real production figures, track inputs, and identify problems as they arose. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about democratizing decision-making. If a factory team knew they were falling behind on output, they didn't have to wait for some distant bureaucrat to notice. They could take action themselves, and in theory, that built a sense of ownership and responsibility from the ground up. Then came the hybrid governance model. This was one of the most ambitious and delicate parts of the project. On one hand, there was central oversight. Chile's government needed a national picture of how the economy was performing. On the other hand, they didn't want to crush local autonomy. The goal was to balance control and freedom, so that local operations could respond to immediate challenges, while the central system ensured those local decisions didn't undermine national objectives. Think of it like a well-run orchestra. The conductor sets the tempo, but each musician still interprets their part within the piece. And finally, technological socialism. This was a big departure from both the Soviet and Western capitalist models. Chile under Allende wasn't interested in replicating the rigid, top-down command economies of the Eastern Bloc, nor did it want to rely on the profit-driven market systems of the West. Instead, Cybersyn represented an attempt to modernize without capitalist dependence. The state would own and coordinate key industries, but the coordination would be informed by real-time data and feedback, not just five-year plans or political guesswork. In this way, technology was meant to be the bridge between socialist ideals and practical economic management. Of course, these ambitions carried risks. Giving workers more data might empower them, or it might overwhelm them if the system wasn't designed well. Central oversight might ensure consistency, or it might creep toward control if political pressures mounted. And building a socialist economy with modern technology might inspire innovation, or invite the suspicion of powerful neighbors who saw it as a threat. But in that moment, in the early 1970s, the possibilities felt exhilarating. Chile was trying to prove that socialism could be efficient, adaptive, and democratic, all at once. And Cybersyn was the centerpiece of that gamble. Yet as with so many ambitious experiments, the fate of Cybersyn would depend not just on ideas, but on politics. And in Chile, politics was about to take a dangerous turn. By the early 1970s, Cybersyn was more than just a prototype, it was starting to prove it could work. But while the system was coming online, the political and economic environment it depended on was unraveling. And in Chile, when politics turn, they can turn fast. The country was facing what can only be described as economic sabotage. Supply chains weren't just strained, they were being actively disrupted. Opposition groups, both domestic and foreign, had an interest in seeing Allende's government fail. Strikes were organized, sometimes by key sectors like truck drivers, who effectively brought the movement of goods to a standstill. Businesses withheld production or refused to cooperate with the nationalized industries. And all of this created an atmosphere where even a sophisticated coordination system like Cybersyn was constantly fighting against deliberate obstruction. At the same time, inflation was spiraling, shortages were worsening, and political polarization was reaching a fever pitch. The country's democratic experiment in socialism was now under immense pressure from both internal dissent and external forces. And those forces were not abstract, they were political actors, foreign governments, and powerful economic interests who saw Allende's reforms as a threat to their influence. Then came the breaking point, September 11, 1973. General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup that overthrew Allende's government in a violent seizure of power. Tanks rolled into Santiago. Fighter jets bombed La Moneda, the presidential palace. Allende refused to surrender, delivering his final speech to the nation before dying that day. With the coup, everything about the Chilean road to socialism came to an abrupt and brutal end, and Cybersyn was no exception. The military junta dismantled the project almost immediately. Its technology, operations room, and networks were seen not as a neutral tool, but as part of the socialist apparatus they were determined to destroy. In the space of a single day, years of careful design and innovation were erased. And that's one of the sobering truths about a system like Cybersyn. No matter how advanced the technology, it cannot survive if the political structure that sustains it collapses. When power changes hands violently, the priorities of the new rulers will decide what lives and what dies. The story could end here, but there's more to learn. The collapse of Cybersyn offers deeper lessons about centralization, political vulnerability, and what happens when technology is tied too closely to a single political project. That's where we turn next. Cybersyn's story is often told as a tale of technological ambition cut short by politics, but hidden within it is a deeper lesson about the nature of centralization itself. On one hand, centralization offers undeniable advantages. By linking Chile's state-run industries through a national telex network and feeding their data into a single operations room, the government could respond to problems far more quickly than through the old bureaucratic channels. A delayed shipment in one factory could be rerouted from another before it caused a full-scale production halt. A shortage of raw materials in the north could be spotted and addressed before it rippled through the rest of the economy. In times of crisis, like the truckers' strike, this kind of rapid coordination wasn't just useful, it was critical. It allowed the government to keep essential goods moving when the normal market mechanisms were being intentionally disrupted. But these strengths came with vulnerabilities baked in. When you centralize a system, you create a single point of visibility, but also a single point of failure. If the operations room was shut down, or the communication lines cut, the flow of information that kept the system running could vanish overnight. And that is exactly what happened after the coup. The central hub was dismantled, the network severed, and the system collapsed almost instantly. There's another dimension to consider: political fragility. Because Cybersyn was so closely tied to Allende's socialist project, it was seen as a political instrument, not just a technical one. This meant its survival depended entirely on the fortunes of one government. In a decentralized model, parts of a system might survive political upheaval, even if leadership changes. But when the system's heart is in a single, politically controlled center, a change in power can destroy it in one blow. This isn't to say centralization is inherently bad. Sometimes it's the only way to coordinate quickly at scale. But Cybersyn shows us the trade-off clearly. The more you concentrate control and oversight, the more efficient your response can be in stable times, and the more fragile your system becomes when that stability shatters. That's why the story of Cybersyn isn't just about one country's attempt to run its economy through cybernetics, it's about the balance between efficiency and resilience. The lessons here still matter, especially in a world where technology increasingly promises instant oversight of entire systems, from supply chains to financial networks. And speaking of the modern world, that's where we're headed next. Because Cybersyn may have been dismantled in 1973, but its echoes can be found in some surprising places today. Even though Cybersyn was physically dismantled in the wake of the coup, its ideas never truly disappeared. In fact, if you look closely, you can see its DNA in the way we build and manage digital infrastructure today. Think about modern supply chains. Corporations now use integrated data dashboards to monitor everything from factory output in Asia to shipping delays in the Panama Canal. They do this in real time, often with predictive algorithms suggesting adjustments before problems explode. Sound familiar? That's the same basic logic Cybersyn was trying to achieve, just with more advanced technology and the benefit of global internet connectivity. We also see echoes in how governments approach crisis management. During pandemics, natural disasters, or sudden market shocks, the push is always toward rapid information gathering, centralized dashboards, and coordinated responses. The idea that you can see an entire system's status at a glance and act decisively is no longer science fiction, it's an expectation. In a sense, Cybersyn was an early prototype for this kind of thinking, only it was doing it in the analog-digital hybrid world of the early 70s. But there's another, more cautionary parallel. The same tools that can keep systems running smoothly can also be used for surveillance and control. In the wrong hands, a nationwide network of data feeds and a central command room could shift from enabling problem-solving to monitoring dissent or enforcing compliance. This is why Cybersyn still sparks debate among historians and technologists. Was it a tool for empowerment, or a step toward centralized power that could be misused? And then there's the political factor. Even the most advanced technology is not immune to the winds of politics. Today's high-tech coordination platforms, whether in logistics, finance, or even governance, still depend on the stability and values of the systems that operate them. The moment that stability collapses, the very same centralization that makes them powerful can make them fragile. So while Cybersyn is often remembered as a fascinating Cold War curiosity, it's more than that. It's a lens for looking at our own world, a reminder that technology and politics are inseparable, and that the way we design our systems reflects our assumptions about power, trust, and control. In our final slide, we'll take these lessons and ask the bigger questions. Could a system like Cybersyn work in a society that values both efficiency and freedom? And if so, what would it take to make it resilient enough to survive the storms of politics? So here we are, at the end of the story of Project Cybersyn, but maybe not at the end of its relevance. Because this isn't just a tale about Chile in the 1970s. It's a mirror we can hold up to our own world and ask some uncomfortable, and maybe even inspiring, questions. First, could something like Cybersyn actually work in a society that values both efficiency and freedom? The idea of connecting an entire economy into a living, responsive system is compelling. It promises to replace sluggish bureaucracy and slow-moving decision-making with real-time insight and rapid problem-solving. But could such a system be built without becoming a tool for political control? Could it thrive in a free society where authority is decentralized, and where the people feeding data into it have as much say over how it's used as the people interpreting it. Second, there's the issue of political dependence. Cybersyn's fate was tied to one administration, one ideology, and one historical moment. Once that moment passed, the system was dismantled almost overnight. So how do you design innovation to outlast the political cycle? Is it possible to build something so useful, so universally beneficial, that it survives changes in leadership, ideology, and even national direction? And then there's the timeless question, is centralized technology inevitably a step towards centralized power? Or can it be designed in ways that distribute authority, empower participants at every level, and resist being hijacked by whoever controls the center? History is full of examples that make us skeptical, but it also shows us moments when technology did decentralize power and expand opportunity. Which path would a modern Cybersyn take? These aren't just hypotheticals. They're questions we should be asking right now, as governments, corporations, and institutions race to build ever more connected, data-driven systems. The stakes are no less real today than they were in 1973. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into one of the most fascinating, and perhaps misunderstood, experiments in economic history. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out my book, History They Tried to Erase, linked in the description. And if you love exploring the past in ways that challenge the usual narratives and make you think differently about the present, you'll find plenty more stories here on Truth Behind History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep digging deeper.